Imagine a world split in two. On one side, you had the United States of America. On the other, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. This was the world after the Second Great War. Two superpowers. Two really different ideas about how society should work. They never fought a direct war. Instead, a Cold War. A war of ideas, a war of influence, a war of technology. Each side watched the other, afraid and suspicious. This fear pushed them to compete in every way imaginable. From building bigger armies, to proving their way of life was better. The global chessboard was set for a grander game. The stage wasn't Earth, it was space. The vast, dark, unexplored expanse above our heads. For centuries people looked up and wondered. Now we had the power to go, to send machines, and maybe even ourselves beyond the blue sky. Conquering the new frontier was more than exploration. It was a statement of power, intelligence, and destiny. October 4th, 1957, a date forever etched in the story of our journey to the stars. From a remote launch pad in what is now Kazakhstan, the Soviet Union launched a rocket. On top of that rocket was a small, polished metal sphere, about the size of a beach ball, 4 long antennas trailing behind it. Its name was Sputnik 1. As it circled the Earth, it did something very simple. It broadcast a tiny, rhythmic signal. Beep, beep, beep. Anyone with a shortwave radio could pick it up as this new man-made moon passed overhead. That simple beep was a shockwave. In America, people looked up with a mix of awe and terror. The Soviets had done it. They had put a satellite into orbit. They had beaten the United States to space. This wasn't just a scientific achievement, it was a political earthquake. It seemed to announce that the Soviet Union was technologically superior. American newspapers were filled with panicked headlines. Politicians demanded action. The Sputnik crisis was born. The idea that the communists could be watching from above, that they were ahead in the rocket race, sent a deep chill through the American public. The man behind the triumph was Sergei Korolev. His identity was a state secret. He was known only as the chief designer. He had survived Stalin's prisons and became the father of the Soviet space program. Before we could send a human into the terrifying void of space, we had to answer a crucial question. Could a living being even survive up there? The launch, the weightlessness, the re-entry, it was all a great unknown. To find the answers, both the Americans and the Soviets turned to silent pioneers, animal astronauts. Soviets favored dogs, stray dogs from the streets of Moscow, tough, resilient, accustomed to hardship. The most famous of these was a little dog named Laika. She was chosen for a one-way mission aboard Sputnik 2 in November 1957. Laika became the first living creature to orbit the Earth. For a brief time, she was the most famous animal on the planet. Her mission was a monumental achievement for Soviet science, but it came at a great cost. Laika was sent into orbit knowing she would not return. Her journey was a sacrifice. It was a sad but necessary step on the path to human spaceflight. The data they provided was absolutely essential. While the Soviets were sending dogs into orbit, the Americans were working with primates. They chose chimpanzees like Ham and Enos. In January 1961, Ham the chimp was strapped into a Mercury capsule and launched on a suborbital flight. He performed his tasks perfectly, proving thinking and motor skills were possible during flight. Ham splashed down safely and became a national hero. These missions were not without controversy. Many people were troubled by the use of animals in such dangerous experiments. These brave animals were the true trailblazers. The next great prize in the space race was clear: to be the first nation to send a human being into space and bring him back alive. Both sides were racing toward this goal with incredible urgency. In the Soviet Union, Sergei Korolev and his team had developed the Vostok spacecraft. They had selected a group of elite pilots for the mission, and from that group, one man was chosen. He was a 27-year-old senior lieutenant with a calm demeanor and a charismatic smile. His name was Yuri Alexeyevich Gagarin. He was the son of a carpenter and a dairy farmer, the perfect symbol of the common man reaching for the stars, smiling Yuri Gagarin in his space helmet. On April 12, 1961, the world held its breath. Strapped inside the tiny Vostok 1 capsule, Yuri Gagarin blasted off into history. As his rocket climbed, he famously shouted, "Poyakali! Let's go!" For 108 minutes he circled the globe, continents, the oceans, the clouds of our planet. He saw the curve of the Earth, he saw the stars in the blackness of space. He described our world as a beautiful, fragile blue marble. Gagarin's flight was a spectacular, undeniable victory for the Soviet Union. Around the world, Gagarin became an instant global celebrity, a hero not just for the USSR but for humanity. It inspired a generation, it showed millions that the impossible was achievable. Upon his safe return, parachuting into a field, he was greeted by a bewildered farmer and her daughter. His status as a legend was sealed. His single orbit changed our relationship with the universe forever. The news of Yuri Gagarin's flight hit the United States like a thunderclap. It was another Sputnik moment, but this time, it was personal. A man was in orbit and he wasn't an American. The pressure on the young president, John F. Kennedy, was immense. The nation's pride was on the line. Just 3 weeks after Gagarin, America sent its first astronaut into space, Alan Shepard. But his flight was a short 15-minute hop, up and down. He didn't orbit the Earth. It felt like a small step compared to Gagarin's giant leap. The Soviet rockets were more powerful. Their program seemed more advanced. President Kennedy knew that simply matching the Soviets step for step was a losing game. America couldn't just aim to be second, it needed a new goal. A goal so bold it would leapfrog the competition. The answer was the moon. On May 25, 1961, President Kennedy stood before Congress and made one of the most daring declarations in history. I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. This wasn't just a challenge, it was a promise. A promise to go from a 15-minute flight to a 500,000-mile round trip in less than 9 years. The Apollo program was born. New technologies, new computers, new materials, a national effort involving over 400,000 people and thousands of companies. It was a gamble, hugely expensive and dangerous. But it was also a source of profound purpose. Kennedy had given America its mission. The race to the moon had begun, and the United States was now running its own race, aimed at a destination far beyond anything the Soviets had yet publicly declared. The journey to the moon was not easy. It was a path marked by both triumph and tragedy. Triumph, tragedy. The astronauts of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs were the public face of this monumental effort. Men like John Glenn, the first American to orbit the Earth, became national icons. But there were dark days too. In January of 1967, Gus Grissom, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, they died in a fire during a launch rehearsal on the ground. It was a horrific tragedy that shook NASA and the nation to its core. For a moment the moon seemed out of reach. But instead of giving up, the Apollo program redoubled its efforts. They redesigned the spacecraft to make it safer. Engineers and astronauts learned from the fire. The race continued. In December of 1968, Apollo 8 flew all the way to the moon. They orbited it 10 times on Christmas Eve. They saw the far side of the moon and took Earthrise, a photograph that would change our perspective forever. Finally, the moment came. July of 1969, the colossal Saturn V rocket stood ready on the launch pad. Inside Apollo 11, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, Michael Collins. The world watched as they blasted off. 4 days later, Armstrong and Aldrin in the lunar module, the Eagle, descended toward the moon's surface. Fuel running dangerously low and alarms blaring. Armstrong took manual control. He guided the lander to a safe spot, the Sea of Tranquility. On July 20th, 1969, Neil Armstrong descended the ladder. He placed his foot onto the lunar soil. As more than 500 million people listened, he said, "That's one small step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." Buzz Aldrin joined him moments later. They planted the American flag, they collected rock samples and hopped around in the low gravity. For a few hours, two humans walked on another world. The United States had won the race to the moon, a defining moment of the 20th century. While the astronauts were the famous faces of the space race, their journey was made possible by an army of brilliant minds. The engineers, the scientists, the mathematicians, the technicians. One of the most important was Wernher von Braun, a German rocket scientist who had developed the V2 for the Nazis. He came to America after the war. His past was controversial, but his genius was undeniable. He helped build the Saturn V. In mission control, flight directors were the conductors of the orchestra of spaceflight. Men like Chris Kraft and Gene Kranz led the teams that made split-second decisions. When Apollo 13 became a desperate struggle for survival, Kranz rallied his team with the motto, "Failure is not an option." Their leadership and ingenuity brought the astronauts safely home. There were mathematicians, human computers, many of them African-American women like Katherine Johnson. Her calculations were essential for missions like John Glenn's orbital flight. They were hidden figures, unsung heroes whose work was as critical as the rockets themselves. Technicians designed circuits, wrote software, sewed spacesuits, and tested every component to its breaking point. They worked long hours, fueled by coffee and patriotism. The astronauts may have taken the small steps on the moon, but they stood on the shoulders of this vast, dedicated army. The victory of Apollo was their victory too. After the United States landed on the moon, the intensity of the space race began to fade. America had achieved Kennedy's goal. The ultimate prize had been won. The Soviet Union had its own secret, unsuccessful lunar program. It shifted to long-duration space stations like Salyut and Mir. The political climate on Earth was changing. The era of détente was beginning. July 1975, the Apollo-Soyuz test project, a historic mission. An American Apollo and a Soviet Soyuz launched and maneuvered to meet in orbit. For 2 days the two crews maneuvered closer in a carefully choreographed orbital dance. The world watched as the two spacecraft docked. American Commander Thomas Stafford reached across and shook hands with Soviet Commander Alexei Leonov. For the first time, astronauts and cosmonauts floated together, sharing meals and conversation in a mix of Russian and English. If they could cooperate in orbit, maybe nations could on Earth. Apollo-Soyuz marked the symbolic end of the space race. The rivalry that began with Sputnik's beep concluded with a handshake. It laid the groundwork for future collaboration, the International Space Station and joint missions that followed. So who really won the space race? The Soviet Union won the early laps, the first satellite, the first animal, and the first man in space. The United States won the marathon, first men on the moon, but in the end, humanity won. The competition pushed both nations to achieve things they might never have done alone. The legacy is woven into our modern lives. Microchips, satellites, GPS, global TV, and better weather forecasting. Medical technology, tools, and countless innovations trace a line back to the space race. Pictures like Earthrise and the Blue Marble showed our world as a single, fragile oasis. That perspective helped inspire the environmental movement and a new global awareness. Perhaps the greatest legacy is inspiration, a generation urged into science, engineering, and the question, what's next?